Greetings to the physics and chem students. My apologies about the IT problems, but Blackboard will not open for me. So today you're getting a pre-recorded lecture. Probably better anyway, because the content of this lecture is huge, and having a pre-recorded session means that you can stop, think, then go back in and watch it again. So we're looking at forces and pressures, and now we're going to relate these forces and pressures to liquids and gases and how we have to use those things in nursing. So just a quick review of last week for students that did not come to class. We looked at force. Remember how you define a force? A force is something that can push or can twist or can pull. And we looked at the different effects that forces can have on objects. So what are some of the different effects? Hopefully you've all finished your questions. We can change the shape. So if you put a push force onto something, you might change the shape, you might change the speed, you could change the direction, you might decelerate it, you might accelerate it. So lots of different things forces can do in relation to, say, bone breaks. If we have a twist, you're going to get a shattering of the bones. If you're going to push, we did a push example in class last week. So remember, you stood on that scale and then you tried to initiate a jump, and you looked at how much your weight increased when you did that jump. And for some people doubled their weight. Now, what's changing? Their weight isn't changing. It's the amount of force that's being pushed onto the scale that changed. So remember, force equals acceleration times mass. So when we start accelerating, our mass increases. All right, then we looked at the center of gravity. Center of gravity is very important when lifting and, of course, when moving any bodies in a bed. And center of gravity, that's where your weight concentrates itself, is your center of gravity. It could be outside of your body if you're leaning forward, but if you're going to pick up a box that's heavy or has a weight, then the center of gravity of that box is important. Where is the weight concentrated? That's where you're going to lift it from. The next thing we did, we looked at the pressure in relation to force. So remember, pressure is the amount of force that's being exerted over a set area. So this week, we have to look at how pressure is measured, how we define it, and how it relates to liquids and gases. So when we're thinking about liquids and gases, we're going to be looking about blood, urine, gases, our breathing. So this is why it's a pretty heavy little lecture today. So remember, stop, think, go and watch a video about it, then come back to it. You don't have to keep watching this same PowerPoint the whole time. But I advise you watch the whole PowerPoint and then you go back and look at the places that you think you need to review. So let's have a look at pressure. So first of all, it's equal to the force divided by the area on which it acts. So remember when we looked at pressure sores and where the most vulnerable area of a person is to get pressure sores is on the heels, on the bony points of the bum, on the elbows, on the little bone on the back of your neck, a head. And that's because you're getting a lot of weight, like the whole weight of the leg, being translated through that little place on the heel. So got a tiny little area which increases the amount of force. So a guy called Pascal invented a system for measuring pressure, and there it is. Pressure equals force divided by the square area. And we measure pressure in pascals because that guy's so great. So 1 pascal of pressure equals 1 Newton of force over a square metre. So that's your standard. Remember those standard international units? 1 pascal equals 1 Newton over 1 square metre. And then when we're looking at partial pressures, we're going to use that 1 pascal is 1 Newton over per square metre to then do our maths. So standard international units. So just a little reminder that wherever there are particles, it doesn't matter if it's in a solid or a liquid or a gas, pressure is being applied to it. On our planet, we always have that force of gravity acting downward, keeping us on that ground. So just a little go over that, those friction points. Tiny little area where the whole weight of the head is being pushed. Here's the shoulder blades. Those shoulder blades, especially in older people, they poke out. And so the whole weight of this thoracic area, remember thoracic area connected by a rib, that is all being pushed down through those 2 little bony protuberances on the shoulder blades. So we get this mass being concentrated in a tiny little area. That's why you get pressure sores. Now today we're looking at pressure in liquids and gases. So we'll be looking at all the different ways, the breathing laws and the blood pressure and all of that. Very important to know that a liquid is a fluid, but a gas is a fluid as well. So a liquid is a state of matter, like a solid is a state of matter and gas is a state of matter, liquid is a state of matter, and changing from one state of matter to another state of matter takes a great deal of energy and lets off a lot of energy. Right, so fluids, a fluid is anything that's going to spill or float or flow, so that means it can be air or it can be water, because air flows into our lungs and air flows out of our lungs. So every liquid and every gas is a fluid, and they have certain laws around them. So let's look at pressure in liquids first, and then we'll go through the gas laws second. So Pascal's principle. Remember Pascal, we measure in pascals. Any change in pressure, if it's enclosed, is going to be distributed over the entire area. So in a solid, we can see the entire weight of the head is going to be pushed down through this tiny little bone on the back of your head, increasing the force in that tiny little area. But in a liquid, so like in the placenta, you've got that little baby floating in that amniotic fluid. If we put a lot of pressure onto that baby, it's going to be translated around the entire baby. So if a mum wants to wear a corset the whole time to pretend that she's not pregnant, then the fetus inside that womb is going to become deformed. That's this principle that all pressure in a liquid will be distributed equally. But of course, this placental, the amniotic fluid, it's actually very powerful in that, say your mum bumps into something, the force of that bump, it's not going to be fixed and located in that one tiny area. It's going to get distributed throughout that liquid so that the force can be absorbed over a very large area. So where if you're going to wear corsets, you're going to deform your baby, in a lot of cases the amniotic fluid is going to save your baby by distributing forces equally and not letting it centre in one place. So if we're looking at how do we save people from pressure sores, then we're going to do a few things that physically change the position of the pressure. We might use padding that will distribute the force across it, or we might just turn the patient every couple of hours. We could check the pressure areas constantly and make sure the person's not sitting in exactly the same place every single time. We can use different devices, and of course we can use things that will distribute pressure equally by using a liquid or a gas pillow. So now we're talking liquid. Let's have a look at the cerebrospinal fluid. So we have this fluid that is created in the middle of our brain by these little ventricles that surrounds our brain, and it surrounds our neurons and our nerves and our spinal cord. And as long as it's inside the skull and the spinal column, it's pretty much separated. We have a blood-brain barrier. So this cerebrospinal fluid, it's created inside the central nervous system, and it stays inside the central nervous system, and it makes sure the pressure in every area is exactly the same. So what we don't want is to increase pressure on our neurons. We want all of the spaces to be exactly the same for our neurons to work properly. So if you get a growth inside that spinal cord, it's not just going to push on that one place. No, it's going to affect the entire space that's normally occupied by that cerebrospinal fluid. So you might get all these effects in the brain, even though this tumour is in the spine. So you can see how these principles of pressure apply very much to how you're going to be diagnosing and treating your patients. So if we're in a laboratory and we've got everything's totally still, like when you're sitting in the bath, I think it was Archimedes that created this particular law, we realize that the pressure that is exerted by a liquid is going to be dependent on how deep that liquid is and how much mass that liquid has. What's the density of it? How tightly bound together are those little atoms in the liquid? Now, in both liquids and gases, this little principle is very, very important to get your head around, that your liquid or your fluid is always going to flow down its pressure gradient. Excuse me, I've got a cold, that's why I have to do work from home. So that means it's going to always flow from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Just like our little molecules in the air when we talk about diffusion and facilitated diffusion, we're talking about particles moving from high pressure to low pressure. Same thing happens in liquids. That's why a lot of our systems are fed by gravity. Now, the greater the difference in the pressure from one end to the other, the faster the flow. So if I put a tank very, 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 very high on a hill, I'm going to get a much faster flow of liquid than if I put a tank right next to my house. So the steeper the pressure gradient, the faster the flow. So you can see one of the reasons why when we put someone on an intravenous fluid, so they're a bit dehydrated and we want to get a bit of fluid off them, we're going to hang that liquid up high. That way we get a nice bit of pressure. See, you've got a lovely big area here going to a small area, which is going to increase the pressure as the flow goes down here. And we need a certain amount of pressure there, because what we don't want is for blood to leave the person and come into the little bag we're using for the saline to hydrate them. We want that saline to always be going into the vein. So the pressure has to be higher than the pressure in the vein to make sure the saline is going to go into the vein. Now, of course, anything provides resistance. Remember, when a force is resisted, we get friction, and when we get friction, we're going to get a little bit of heat, and that's one of the things that makes pressure sores happen. Now, in a liquid, we still get resistance. It just depends on how thick the liquid is, how wide the tube is, how long that tube is. So it just depends on the volume that the liquid is going through, and how thick, how close together are the molecules inside that liquid. So that's called viscosity. How close together are those molecules? How much do they want to stay together? Honey is a great example because when honey reaches a certain temperature, actually it changes state and becomes a solid. But even when it's really, when you warm it up, it still wants to cling together. So viscosity is about how thick is that liquid, how much resistance is that liquid going to have to movement. Then we know how much force needs to be applied to move it. So when we look at our blood, it's pretty viscous. We've got a lot of stuff in this blood. I mean, I think about 80% is mostly plasma, which is mainly water. But then you have white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets. You've got little bits of food and sugar. So there's a lot of stuff in our blood. It's quite thick. And you can see that if you cut yourself, when you put water onto blood, it just diffuses straight through it, straight away. But at first, it's nice and thick and it likes to stay together and we get drops. So as people get older and their pressure is less, then a lot of them are going to be put on blood thinners to thin that blood out, and then it can get through the system more. So viscosity, it will change depending on the health of the person, depending on if they have a disability like diabetes or a disorder, and how much water they're drinking. Now, pressure in a liquid, when we look at blood, we've talked about it in the integumentary system, and we're going to talk about it again and again. If we increase the volume, vasodilate, of the blood vessels in our dermis, we're going to lose more heat because we're going to bring more blood up through that insulating area into the dermis. So the larger our blood vessel, the lower the pressure is inside it. So the larger the diameter, so as we vasodilate all of those blood vessels in our dermis, we're actually dropping our blood pressure in the dermis, in those vessels. So we increase the size, we vasodilate, we're going to lower the pressure. If we're going to decrease the size of a blood vessel, we're going to vasoconstrict it to make that blood vessel smaller. Now, as we make that blood vessel smaller, we decrease the volume, so we increase the pressure. So that means that we need a lot more pressure to move the fluid that's inside of it. So diameter is definitely going to change the pressure. Flow patterns are another thing that are going to change our pressure. So in our lymphatic system, we don't have a heart pushing that fluid up back to the heart. Instead, we have a whole lot of vacuums and one-way valves that are streamlined. They have the one-way valve actually moves fluid through it. So streamlined flow, you've got lower pressure in our lymphatic system. We have a much lower pressure. The squeezing of our muscles tends to push that liquid forward, and breathing, changing our pressure in our lungs, pulls it forward. So a streamlined flow, you've got lower pressure. And a turbulent flow, that's when you're going to have something like a bit of sclerosis inside the blood vessel. So it's creating like a rock in the water, so waves have to break around it. Once you get a turbulent flow, you get a much higher pressure, and you also get other related problems. So the big thing you've got to get from this is that if we increase the volume of the blood vessel, we're going to decrease the pressure. If we increase the length of the blood vessel, we're also going to increase the pressure. So if we've got a great big long blood vessel, we need a lot of pressure from the heart to get that moving. So in our cardiac system, it's like a big one-way open valve. It's from the heart all the way back to the heart. There's nothing blocking that, so the heart has to provide a great deal of pressure constantly. However, in our lymphatic system, where it's a one-way valve and a vacuum and a one-way valve and a vacuum, it doesn't need a lot of pressure in there. It just needs to have lovely grooves so that when that one-way valve, that vacuum's squeezed, the pressure forces it into the next vacuum. So when we're looking at blood pressure, we're going to measure it using one of these tools. We've got a few great new tools for measuring blood pressure, of course. So they're called a sphygmomanometer, and if anybody, I want you to look up what do those different parts of those words mean for med terms tomorrow. Now, when we're measuring it, we're not measuring it in pascals, we're actually measuring it in millimeters of mercury, because that was the first consistent measuring tool that was invented, and it was so good we've just used it for hundreds of years. So, what are we measuring when we measure blood pressure? If anybody's had their blood pressure taken, you know what the cuff does, it stops the flow. So there is no, so it increases, so you stop the whole flow. Then you get out your little hearing devices, put them onto the artery, and you listen for when are you hearing the very first sound. So that's your highest pressure. We've cut the blood off. So therefore we have reduced the length of that vessel, and we've made it build up to its maximum pressure by not allowing any liquid to escape. That is called, that high pressure, the very first pressure that we're measuring, that's the systolic. How much pressure, what's the maximum amount of pressure your blood vessels will take in that area. So this is when our big bottom bits of the heart, our ventricles, are contracting. We're measuring how much pressure are these ventricles creating as they force the blood into the arterial tubes. Now the diastolic pressure, that's when all of the, you can't hear anything anymore. The very last beat that you hear is your minimum amount of pressure. So the minimum pressure, that's when your ventricles are totally filled up with blood. So systolic, your peak; diastolic, your valley. So if you're looking at a bell curve, and you're looking at people between the ages of about 20 to 35, 40, it's 120 over 80 is a nice healthy blood pressure. You definitely have to know these terms and be able to define these terms for your blind assessment. So memorize them. Get out your flip cards and memorize them. All right, now we're going to look at gas pressure. Now, if you want to have a break now, turn it off, have a break, because now we're going into a whole different state. We're looking at gas, and we're really focusing on breathing at the moment. So when we look at gas pressure, we look at how much pressure is being exerted on the walls of the container that is holding the gas. So the more particles you have inside the container, the more pressure that we'll be able to measure on the sides of the container. Now, why are we measuring on the sides of the container? Because remember, diffusion. None of these atoms are ever going to be still. all of the time. They're all constantly trying to be equidistant, but because they're all moving, they keep invading each other's space and having to bounce out again to get their distance. So what we're measuring is how is those particles bouncing on the sides of the container. So the more particles you're going to have in there, the more particles are going to bounce off the container, so therefore the more pressure they're going to exert. And that's because they have more mass. Every particle, as small as it is, it weighs something. So now we're going to look at the gas laws, and you have to be able to define each of these 3 gas laws in your blind assessment. So we're looking at changes in pressure and volume and temperature. So just like we're looking at in our liquids, if we increase the volume, we decrease the pressure. Now, when we look at gases, temperature is going to really dictate how much volume that gas is going to take up, and therefore how much pressure that gas is going to put on the sides of a container. So when we look at our gas laws, pressure, volume and temperature, they're all interrelated. If I change one thing, I'm going to change the other. Now, can you see how this relates to homeostasis in our body? If we change the temperature of our body, we're going to change the pressure in a lot of places. So we're going to put ourselves out of homeostasis, not just in relation to our temperature. No, we're going to put ourselves out of homeostasis in our urinary system and in our digestive system and in our respiratory system because the pressure and the volume are being affected. Now, what you don't need to know is the mass, you just need to know how to define it. So here are the 3 different gas laws that you need to be able to identify and define. Boyle's law, we're going to look at Boyle's law in breathing because Boyle's law is all about changing volume and pressure. Dalton's law we're going to look at a lot when we're looking at what's in your blood. So this is looking at partial pressures, and we can measure how much of each different gas has been dissolved into the blood by looking at these different pressures. And the last one, was Henry's law. Now go back. Sorry, I'm not going backwards on this. All right, let's start with Boyle's law and then we'll come into the rest and I'll make sure I don't touch it again. So when we look at Boyle's law states that if I increase the volume, I will decrease the pressure. And that's how we breathe. You know, we don't have a vacuum cleaner sitting under that diaphragm sucking the air in. No, the way that we get air to flow inside of our lungs is by changing the volume in our thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity's got the ribs on it, remember? And the ribs totally encapsulate the lungs and the diaphragm sticks onto the bottom of them, the lungs. Now, so when we are breathing, as the diaphragm relaxes, we're also contracting all of these muscles on the inside of the ribs. We're pulling the ribs in close to the spinal column. We're dragging that diaphragm down toward our stomach, and we're really reducing increasing the volume. No, we're reducing the volume. So we're letting the diaphragm relax. And, I'm going to start this again because of those pictures. Because as you breathe in, your diaphragm drops. Let me just start from the beginning. As we breathe in, first of all, the muscles on the outside of the ribs are going to contract. They're going to make your ribs lift up and flare out. That's going to increase the volume of the lung cavity. Now, your diaphragm is attached to the bottom of your lung here, and that's going to be pulled down. Again, we're increasing the volume inside our thoracic cavity. Now, the pressure of the air outside is much higher than the pressure of the air inside of our lungs. And so air flows into our lungs through that natural gradient. the pressure gradient. To get the air out of our lungs, then I'm going to contract all of the muscles on the inside of my ribs and bring them close to my spinal column and heart. And I'm going to let my diaphragm relax, and it just pushes up into the lung volume, which further minimises the volume inside of here. Now my pressure in the lungs is huge compared to outside, and the air naturally flows its longer pressure gradient outside. Now, you definitely need to be able to discuss Boyle's law and breathing. That was a pretty bad description, so go and look at a video, and there's a couple in your learning material. Now, Dalton's law is the law of partial pressure, and when we're trying to find out, is somebody's blood unbalanced? Is it the actual pH of the blood or the gases inside the blood that are causing their illness? This is when we use Dalton's law, because what Dalton found out was that gases move along their own pressure gradient. That's how diffusion actually works, is that they're moving from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure for their particular atom. So we can find out how much oxygen is in the blood compared to carbon dioxide in the blood by working out the partial pressure of these gases. Oh, I see, there's something happening. Okay, so the sum of the partial pressure of each gas will equal how much gas is actually inside the liquid. So the higher the pressure of the gas, the more gas it's going to go into the liquid and dissolve into that liquid. Now, Henry's law, this is the third law that you have to note. So in Henry's law, the more the partial pressure of the gas, the more the gas will dissolve. So if the pressure drops suddenly, the dissolved gases will bubble out of the liquid. So you see that every time you open up a can of soft drink. So we can force gas into a sealed container, but the minute we open it, it'll head out. So that's one of the things that Henry's law is one of the laws that we use when we are assisting people with breathing difficulties. So if you got someone who's, we looked at it in med terms, but when you look at someone who at first they can breathe okay with real air, and the percentage of oxygen in their blood had to be above 96. Once that percentage of oxygen dropped a little bit below 96, then we put on some nasal prongs. And we allowed and put a flow of air in through the nasal prongs, which would increase the pressure in the lungs. But then again in our little example, we found that the oxygen still dropped, the partial pressure of oxygen still dropped, and then we had to put them on a mask with oxygen like this little wee teddy bear's got. That way we can put a lot more pressure into the lungs.